Several weeks ago when Pastor Steve and I were shuffling around the schedule because of graduations and travelings and all of that stuff, he asked me to take this particular weekend, and I said, sure. But in that moment, God did something that he very rarely does for me, and that is what he actually dropped the title for this sermon in my spirit in that moment. That does not happen. I often have to wrestle with God to get to where he wants to be because, we've all got plans, right? So in that moment, God dropped the title, The Power of Your Personal Testimony, in my heart and in my mind in that moment. And I started thinking about that. And I started to work through that. And then I realized, I think I've given my testimony here over the last 5 years. I think I've done that 2 or 3 times. And you could hear my testimony again. I like my testimony. God has done great things for me. But then I ran into my brother last weekend. Brody is going to come speak for us in just a moment. And what I realized is what God was offering me was an opportunity for you to hear his testimony. Now, I believe in the power of personal testimony. If you have not written down your testimony, shame on you, you should do it immediately. You really should. Your life and your testimony have power far stronger than something you're telling about somebody else having done or seen or had God do something for them. Your personal testimony is extraordinarily powerful. And if you want to argue with that point with me, I will remind you that the Bible is nothing more than God's personal testimony. It is literally the testament of the Lord. Well, you see some familiarity in those words. Now, I am going to say, my brother's testimony can be a little rough in some of the subject matter. So if there are particular subjects, I think we've either got very small children or no children in here, and that's probably pretty good in this particular moment. If you are bothered by the content, feel free to step outside. No one's going to point a finger at you or laugh at you or yell at you. And if they do, let me know, and I'll show them just how violent, just how displeased I can be with that sort of behavior. So with that out of the way, would you please welcome my only brother, Brody Miller, to come to the platform.
Thank you. Thank you for the warning as well. I have a story to tell you about a child who started running from God and just kept running as a man to his own destruction and despair. First, I'd like to thank Billy for the invitation to share my story and what the Lord's done for me here today. But I'm going to start by sharing a little bit about how my life went when I was trying to run things. I was born into the church. I was a preacher's kid. But my story is fairly typical for most of what doctors used to refer to as the hopeless kind of alcoholic and addict. I started drinking and smoking weed in my early teens, always telling myself I wouldn't do that next thing. I'd never touch the hard stuff. After trying meth, I'd never do cocaine. Then I did cocaine. Well, never smoked crack. Until it got up to the point that I just quit saying I'd never. I quit drawing that line in the sand. It got out of control pretty fast. We're going to fast forward to 19. I'd already been through 2 miscarriages. I'd been kicked out of the Army before I even made it to boot camp. I dropped out of school. I'd been beaten nearly to death. Already been through my first rehab and already relapsed. I was doing anything I could that I could get my hands on, just trying to fill that hole that was left in me. I had a hole inside that was so large, I had to wonder how I hadn't fallen into it. Or maybe I had. It was hard to tell. I had nothing but a drug addiction, a bad attitude, 2 arms covered in tracks, strung out, already exhausted. At one point during all this, I remember praying the prayer, is what I call it. You know, the prayer where you beg God just to take you. Get it over with. I'm not doing anyone any good here anyway. I I was miserable. I felt betrayed, and I had this massive hole of hurt that I had no idea how to cope with. It wasn't long after that I met my future wife. She was able to convince me to give up the needle, but not the drugs, and she became my moderator. We were married 2 days after my 20th birthday. She had children already, and a year later, she had my son. He was my first experience of having someone or something that was more important than me. And I promised him we would be best of friends. And while I wish I could say, so from there everything got better, it's not how the story goes. With addiction, simply having a child, loving that child, and wanting the best for that child doesn't fix anything. It doesn't stop that daily compulsion to get high. I was able to moderate my addiction with my wife's admonishments. I became a functional addict. But with drug addiction plaguing me, it was always going to fail. About 7 or 8 years in, our marriage started falling apart. And one day it was all gone in a flash. My wife had packed everything up, took my son and our 2 stepchildren, or my 2 stepchildren, and drove away. And who could really blame her? I mean, I found a way, but no one else would find a way to blame her. I could, I promise you that. I go from having teenagers and children constantly running through the house for the last 9 years to dead silence. Deep, haunting, unrelenting silence. The silence was the most peculiar thing. It was loud. The only way to describe it is maybe a deafening silence. So quiet that everything in me screamed. At this point, a sane person would probably have been like, yeah, I'm going to go get some help. But I was an addict, and there's nothing sane about addiction. So naturally, everything that happened was someone else's fault. And with her gone, well, there went any sense of moderation. My heart is broken again. I'm strung out again. Except now I'm my own supplier. The next few years I wouldn't even call a spiral, it was a plummet. I lost my job, burned the kitchen up in a place I was renting, ran through my modest retirement fund, had no income from anything other than drugs and the support from my parents. I had no hope, and by this time I realized that this was either going to kill me or I was going to end up in prison, and I really didn't care. I was well over the trying to quit or hoping things would get any better. My options as I saw them were death or prison. Feeling sorry for me, my parents set me up in a place out in the country, kind of out of the way, in the hopes that I'd pull through it. But that was never going to help. In 2008, there was an incident in my home, and the police ended up searching the place. My home was condemned as a chemical hazard, and I was arrested. My parents bailed me out. I have no idea why. So I paid them back the only way I knew how, by straightening up and getting my life together. Oh, wait, no, it's me we're talking about. Within weeks, I was arrested again by the Drug Task Force. I was in my truck with a full meth lab in the back seat. Not to mention that my girlfriend was a couple of months pregnant. So I'm sitting in jail realizing that it was time to pay the piper, and I was about to spend the next 10 to 20 years of my life in prison with no hope of getting out. 3 felonies in 2 different counties. Just no way I wasn't going to spend a bunch of time in prison. Realizing that my son was going to be grown by the time I got out. And wondering if the baby was mine, and realizing if she was, I wouldn't get to meet her until she was almost grown, or at best a teenager. And would she even want to meet me after that? Spoiler alert, she was mine. She's kind of awesome, even if sometimes I am the worst. I called my mom from jail, and I apologized for all the pain and all the suffering that I had caused. And I told her that I knew they couldn't afford to bail me out, and that I didn't want them to, even if they could. I didn't want them shelling out another $5 or $10 grand just to get me out for a few months. before I was sent off to prison for decades. She told me, we're going to get you out, but you can't come home. You have to go to rehab. Mind you, she's talking to an addict when she says that. Well, anywhere's better than jail, right? So I go to an inpatient rehab. That's a behavioral mod rehab down in Pine Bluff. And of course, I'm acting a fool, just trying to get through. My mindset at the time was, I'm going to beat these charges. I had no intention of getting clean or changing anything. I just needed the judge to think I was. I was so bad off that the lady who ran the place told the owner that I was, and I quote, the most negative brother in the place. Well, A, I didn't have a clue what she meant. And B, there were a couple of men paroled out to that place for murder, and I was the worst behaved. This was behavior mod, so we had what was called confrontation night. If anyone observed any negative behavior, they'd drop your name and what you did in a box, and if your name was in that box, once a week you had to sit in a circle on a stool, hands down by your side, make eye contact with whoever was talking to you. And anyone who wanted could tell you all about yourself. You could do nothing but listen. Couldn't say a word, couldn't move. I was in that circle every week for at least the first 8 to 10 weeks. I was miserable, and these folks were full of it. I had my first court date in Lonoke County, and my father was going to take me to court that morning. Mind you, I hadn't seen my family, including my son, since the day I was admitted, because you have to earn visitation through good behavior, and up to this point, I was incapable. The morning of court, when my dad picked me up, I had packed all my belongings into a trash bag. I threw them in the back of the truck. I jumped in and threw one of my epic fits. You ever seen a drug addict throw a fit? It's a lot like a 2-year-old, but with more cursing and holes in a wall. I was wound up. I'm not coming back here. I don't care if I have to be homeless. Blah, blah. I'm yelling and I'm cussing. I'm giving it the old what for. And when I took a breath, my dad just looked at me and said, son, here's the problem. If I don't bring you back here, you have to go to jail. One of the conditions of your bond is that you're in that rehab, and if you go back to jail and spend the next 10 years there, I may never see you a free man again in my life. It was like a gut punch. It was the first time anyone had actually gotten through to me in years. It stopped me in my tracks. And it was about that time that I looked back in the back seat, and there was my son, tears streaming down his face, who all the way there was just excited to see his dad for the first time since he went to jail. I hadn't even noticed he was in the truck. My best friend, I didn't even see him back there. Was on the drive feeling like a dog that I decided, okay, I'll give this thing a try. What's the worst that could happen? I'd never use again? Couldn't be that bad, could it? It's not. I started participating in group. I quit treating rehab like it was just a place to hang out and started working on my steps. However, folks, I was determined to not let God into my recovery. Step one is we admitted we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behaviors and that our lives had become unmanageable. Well, anyone in their right mind could have told you that my life was pretty unmanageable and that I was powerless to change it. I wasn't even in my right mind, and I knew this much. I had come to this conclusion years earlier, and I didn't know how to get out. I was completely baffled. I really saw no other possible outcomes other than death or prison, and it looked like prison was on the menu. My step two, I struggled with. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It wasn't that the power greater than myself or God's ability to restore me that I had a problem with. It wasn't that he could, but that he would. I had allowed the enemy to convince me that God wanted nothing to do with me, Why would he? And because I am who I am, and I'd never have done things the right way, and why would I start now? I started to do all this work without a sponsor, and again was determined to leave God out of this work. And then comes step 3. We made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God. Not doing that one. Next, I went straight to step 4. We made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. My step 4 was pretty ugly. Everyone's is, and my step 8 was completely unmanageable. I had a list as long as my leg of people I'd harmed. 8 is we made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And if you're thinking, hey, how did we get to 4 to 8? Didn't you skip a few steps? Of course I did. I had no idea how to address any of these things, how to fix any of this. And there were a few people on that step 8 that I really hoped I'd never saw again in my life. I was trying to move forward with decades of pain, suffering, guilt, shame weighing me down, and feeling pretty overwhelmed. I felt like I was going to drown. It was killing me. I could see myself coming to a dead end, feeling like failure was imminent. My behavior had started to improve a little, so I had the opportunity to visit a Celebrate Recovery meeting once a week. They're normally held in churches, sponsored by churches. It was over in Whitehall, and the church food was outstanding. They eat before. And I don't know if anybody's ever been in rehab, but they only feed you 3 times a day, and you can only have 1 plate. And I was always hungry. So I went for the food, and these ladies could really cook. Well, it was in one of those meetings while I was drowning in my moral inventory, my character defects and amends lists, and taking a long, hard look at the person I had become, that a lady made a statement, "Leave your burden at Jesus' feet." And for some reason that resonated with me. I couldn't tell you what she said before that or after that. And here I am thinking, he probably wants nothing to do with me. Why would he help me? But what do I have to lose? I didn't realize I was about to take the most important step in my life. One of the single most important things I have ever done. So that night I got down on my hands and knees and I prayed. It was a simple prayer of ignorance, coming from an old addict. And it just simply said, I simply said, "Jesus, I have no idea how to leave something at your feet." And that very moment, I had a moment in the presence of God that I'll never forget and I will always cherish. He met me right where I was at. Even with my limited understanding of who he was or even how to pray, even scared to death of him, he met me right where I was at. So I started laying these things down. Lord, you can have all this guilt for the pain I've caused my son, my mother, the shame and embarrassment that I've caused my father and my brother, the many sleepless nights my mom and grandmother spent praying for me just to survive, the upcoming prison sentences, the shame, the disgust, the weakness, and the anger, even the anger I felt towards him for the death of my grandmother, the anger I felt towards myself, and finally the hurt and anger I felt over those 2 babies I had lost to miscarriage years ago. There was nothing I could do for them but leave them there with Jesus. It was during this time with Jesus, while I could feel the strength, peace, and his infinite patience, that it all fell into place. All the work I had done meant nothing without God. Finally, I was able to start looking forward and not back, no longer weighed down by the guilt and the pain of my past. I will say there were times I tried to go pick things back up and worry over them, especially the prison sentences. Once I realized I'd tried to take back control and that I was walking around with something I'd already left with him, I'd go back to him in prayer, set it back down. Lord, I believe this is yours. Well, I didn't quite realize it at the time. What I was doing was making Jesus the foundation of my recovery, and my recovery the foundation of the rest of my life. It's biblical, though I just happened to stumble upon it. Luke tells us in Acts 17:27-28, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Things started turning around for me, and I transferred to an outpatient facility here in Little Rock to finish out my 18 months mandated by my bond agreement and eventually by the courts. There was this new thing out called K2, and the rehab wasn't testing for it. A lot of folks were smoking it, and there were a few folks drinking because they never had a drinking problem. And the Lord made sure I understood that I couldn't cheat. Others may, and they may get by with it, but I couldn't. At this point, every day, the freedom I had was at his mercy, and I couldn't hide from him. While things were getting better, I had managed to get probation from Lonoke County, but I still had Pulaski County to deal with. And well, I'd already used my first-time offender deal. It was August 2009, and it's time to go to court. I spoke to my public defender, I think it was the night before my court date, and she said, I don't think the prosecutor knows about your conviction in Lonoke County, and it's not my job to tell them. Sure enough, we get to court, and they offer me a first-time offender deal, probation. I was not prepared for what happened next. Success. Wait, I'm not going to prison? I mean, I deserve to be in prison. And much to my shame, that night, I went to get high. I eventually learned in recovery that it's not only failure that can cause a person to slip. Success can be just as dangerous. As sick as it sounds, we're used to failure. But in many of our cases, it's been a long, long while since we have experienced anything that sounds like success. But remember that foundation I've been building on for the last 6 months or so? I went to 2 different people I'd known for decades, and both refused to get me high. I remember being so angry with these 2 guys. I'd known them most of my life. How dare they? What's wrong with them? So I drove back to the rehab, and I went to bed. And I thank Jesus. Every time I have truly let go and left situations which were out of my control to God's control, things have turned out better than I could have ever imagined. There have been no relapses, not a single time. My compulsion to use completely gone. I never saw a day in prison. And when I needed a job, he gave me a career. When I was facing prison, he gave me freedom. When I wasn't capable of managing that freedom, he protected me. He has blessed me in many ways, sure. And by measure of man, my life since has been a success. The possessions, well, I'm thankful for them. Those aren't the things I'm most proud of, because the Bible tells us he'll take care of us. The things Jesus has blessed me with extend way past material things. I can still remember how dumbfounded I was the first time I realized that I was capable of making good decisions. The right decision, the hard decision, and I'd done it without conflict or even much consideration. Coming to the realization that I was no longer my own worst enemy. I still remember the day that I first met my daughter. She was already around 8 months old, and he had blessed me with another best friend. And now I have 2, both of whom, by the grace of God, I'm still very close with today. I remember worrying about my son when his mother was facing the consequences of her drug addiction. And he blessed me with the ability to provide for and guide him through his final years as a teenager and into adulthood and beyond. A few weeks after he moved out, the Lord gave me custody of my daughter. I can't begin to express how much it means to me that I'm able to provide for her and care for her, to be a parent and a friend to her, and just to be there for her. I am so thankful the Lord gave me a chance to be there for my mother during one of the worst times of her life. While I could never make up for the bad years, I am blessed to have had a chance to help her when life handed her pain beyond belief. I was able to help pick her up when life had crushed her. I owe her more than I could ever repay, but I am thankful I was able to be there when she needed someone. I now get to work with others in recovery, sharing my experience, strength, and hope with them. I get the opportunity to pass along the testimony of what God can and will do when you seek him and try to live each day in his will. I am grateful to God that my aunts and my grandmother on my dad's side were able to see me get sober before they all passed. My grandmother was probably one of the most godliest women I had ever met. And she told me one time, Brody, I just wake up in the middle of the night and pray for you. And I needed it. While they are all in God's kingdom now, they did get to see me get sober and be a productive member of society before they passed. Matthew recounts the words of Jesus in chapter 7, verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. There was one point during all of this where things were in turmoil. It seemed like everyone around me, including my family, was facing some crisis or another. And I remember hanging up the phone after having the last of many conversations, this one with a particular family member. And I remember thinking that day, when did I become the responsible one? When did I become the peacemaker or the person that's called when things are going haywire? How did that happen? And then I realized that's not what was really going on. They were reaching for the steady, understanding, caring voice of a friend or family member who wouldn't judge or criticize, who would understand. And that, my friends, was because of the foundation of my life that I had found that day on the floor of a rehab in Pine Bluff. There is no more solid a foundation than Jesus. Others in your life will see the stability, and when they need anchoring, when chaos is raging all around, they will reach for the most solid thing they can find. I could never have imagined that one day that would be me, and all glory goes to God. I am so thankful God was willing to meet me right where I was. I have been baptized in water in Jesus' name for the remission of my sins, to be fully forgiven and my sin washed away. I've been called a cheat, a thief, a junkie, a worthless dopehead, and much worse, I'm sure. Today, the adjectives have changed, but there's really only one that makes any difference to me. I no longer worry about what the world calls me, because I am called by the Lord a child of God. Doing my best to grow spiritually every day. Spiritual progress, not perfection. You will not find perfection in this room, but you can find people throughout who can tell you how God has changed their life. And I thank God for each and every one of those stories. And if there's anyone out there right now burdened, weary, tired beyond belief, if you have a hole in your heart that seems big enough that you could fall into it, if you prayed that prayer, I beg you to reach out to him. Make him the foundation of your life. Personally, I have never regretted it. Thank you for your time.
You know, I've heard that story. I lived that story. And I appreciate you being willing to do that. I pray that it had an impact on your life. But I want you to note that even within his testimony, there was a testimony. Because what finally changed him, what finally got his attention, was one woman's testimony. Leave your burden at Jesus' feet. That is the reason that your personal testimony has power. What'd you say? I couldn't tell you what she said before or after. But that moment of her testimony changed a life. So too can yours. So I encourage you. I thank you for being willing to do that, to be so transparent with us. I started to say I thank you for what you've been through, but that's probably the wrong words to say there. I thank you for how it turned out. How's that? I thank God for how it turned out. And I will encourage you again. I said this before, I'll say it again. If you haven't taken the time, your personal testimony is not going to look like his. It's not going to look like mine. It's not going to look like the person sitting next to you. But you never know when your personal testimony will affect and change someone else. So I encourage you to take the time to write it down, to think about it. The act of writing it down kind of solidifies it for us. And I don't think, God being a God of order, I don't think he's going to bring the person into your life who needs to hear your testimony until you're ready with your testimony. You see, we are not waiting on God most of the time. God's really waiting on us most of the time. Amen. Heavenly Father, I give you praise and glory and honor, and I thank you for what you're doing in our lives, in this world, in the heavenly abodes, preparing a place for us. I thank you for what you did and continue to do in my brother's life, in my life, in the lives of the people in this congregation. I thank you for proof that no matter how bad life gets or seems, it is never beyond you. Praise and glory and honor to you, for you are worthy to receive. In the precious name of Yeshua, I pray. Amen. Yivarech Adonai ve'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav alecha v'chunecha, Yisa Adonai panav alecha v'yasem lecha shalom.
When in the Central Arkansas area, we would like to invite you to join us in person. Shabbat service begins at 1 p.m. each Saturday, with Oneg at 3 p.m. and Torah study at 4 p.m. All service times are Central Standard Time. Thanks for watching.